So this meeting of the Healthy Buildings Accountability Board, I'm calling to order. Looks like we have at least one member present online. Do we have to do something to allow Thomas to vote? Okay. We need a vote to approve virtual attendance. Do we need a motion to vote? Okay, so calling the meeting to order on March 6th at 10:07. So first item on the agenda is announcements. Is there any announcements? Nope.
I don't know the date. Do you know the date, Bob?
March 19th.
March 19th. Connections in collaboration with Elevate and the Environmental Climate Group. I don't know the. Yeah, Climate Action.
ACEEE Climate Evanston Group.
Yes, we're hosting a panel discussion from 1:45 to 2:30 on building a bridge of justice between environmental sustainability and affordability. And Bob is our moderator, and Daryl Fairweather, who's the chief economist at Redfin, is a panelist, and Jonathan Nusma is a panelist, and then the other panelist is
The CEO of C&T. Her name is Nina Inamudia.
Yep. So we invite you all. It's free, open to the public.
Could you remind us what date that is, just for a minute?
It is
purposes?
March 19th at the Women's Club from
Great.
1:45 to 2:30.
Excellent.
And if anyone wants to, I can get you the information to pre-register, but it's free and open to the public.
Okay, after announcements, is there any public comment?
And we did not receive any written public comment.
Okay, seeing none in person. Moving to approval of the minutes. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes from February's meeting?
I have a comment. It's just a correction. Under P1, it says motion board chair shall. I'm not the board chair. I'm just a member. That was probably a carryover from environment board or something. Okay.
And Kara Pratt was not present, so I'll correct both of those.
Okay, Kirsten, do we need to approve Thomas so that we can vote on this?
Yeah, you could do either. I mean, you have quorum, so you technically don't need him. I mean, we always need you, Tom, but
That's okay.
you could, since we're in the middle of this, vote on minutes.
Okay,
And then vote
Tom,
to approve him, just to get one thing done.
hopefully you don't have a big issue with that. I think it'll be all right.
I'm good.
Okay, so do we have a motion to approve the minutes following Paula's comments? All those in favor? Oh, seconded by Baxter. All those in favor? Okay. Staff updates is next.
I gotta press the button. Vote on Tom.
I'm sorry, y'all. I actually don't even know what we say for this?
That's okay.
You would entertain a motion to approve virtual meeting attendance.
Okay, I would entertain a motion to approve virtual meeting attendance.
Hi, Bob.
All those in favor?
Nope, I will do the staff update. I was just typing. All right. So, whoa. Hold on just a second. I wanted to give you all an update. Here, let me pull this up. ACEEE funding opportunities. Okay, sorry. Wanted to pull up the PDF actually. So, not long after I started working for the city, we became aware of a technical assistance opportunity through ACEEE, which stands for the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. And they have a particular program that's called Energy Equity for Renters. So we went ahead and applied with assistance from Kristen White and Connections for the Homeless, and we actually were awarded this technical assistance grant. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about it. I don't have a lot of details because our kickoff meeting hasn't happened yet, so we don't have the details. But really what I wanted to let you know, so this is really an effort to work with, Connections for the Homeless and identify renters that are in properties that are potentially subject to the HBO, and to really try and understand what the energy burdens or the utility burdens are of that population. We want to really identify those utility burdened households, kind of understand what the extent of the utility burden is, and then really try and create a roadmap to implement measures that will significantly reduce the high energy burdens these households face. So hopefully the data that we gather, this will be done through a survey that ACEEE hosts on their survey platform. They then also do the analysis afterwards. So we hope that that'll really help us support and perhaps even, identify those not only renters but also properties that will be needing special assistance to comply with the HBO. So with the results of the renter surveys in hand, we then want to approach the landlords. And either that might be more survey work or focus group work, we don't really know yet, to try and understand the awareness that these property owners have of the HBO, what kind of challenges they might be facing, either operational barriers to compliance or just, financial and technical. And so trying to understand what would be most helpful for them. And hopefully with information from both renters and property owners, we're kind of hoping to set up some kind of dialogue that'll really help us address meeting the HBO requirements in an effective and constructive way for both of those populations. So that's kind of just the high level. And then as we develop, I think, additional details, we'll share them with you.
Are you able to talk about the amount of the grant and also the sort of the timeline by which
Sure.
these surveys will be accumulated and results available?
Yeah. So the only funding that was available was funding for the nonprofit or the organization that the city would be working with. So Connections for the Homeless will be awarded $10,000 to help cover their time, and also incentives such as gift cards or such that might be needed for the survey to thank people, encourage people to participate. The kickoff is scheduled here for March, the next week, and then the first round of surveys of the renters is scheduled for early summer. Then the analysis after that will take us to the second round of surveys or focus groups in probably early fall. And then it'll all wrap up. It's basically a 12-month project.
Is this primarily staffed by connections then, with support from the city? Like, who? Just curious as to who would be doing all of this work. Or is there also support from ACEEE to do the work?
So the survey setup, the survey administration, the data analysis, helping us put the surveys together, the focus groups, et cetera, that's done by ACEEE. And then connections and the city are working with them to implement this.
Can I ask, can we engage members of this committee as we start to kind of flesh out the survey? Because when we were invited in, I thought it was a really good opportunity to set up the project so we can collect information both from renters and landlords that can help inform our own thinking. And from my understanding, our primary function, since we work with a lot of low-income renters and landlords in Evanston, is we're sort of the vehicle for outreach to bring them together and kind of inform them of the opportunity to give feedback. So that's kind of, and so we're looking at, is there a way to incentivize engagement with those individuals, which is primarily what the funding would be for.
So we'll keep you posted.
Do we have a number of how many people this would affect and how many buildings, covered buildings, it would be under? This grant would be under?
Not at this time. But we're hoping to get a few hundred survey responses. So.
Just under staff announcements, would it make sense to also just mention that Sustain Evanston, I think, went live this week? Went live.
Yeah, so Sustain Evanston program launched this week. Due to funding constraints this year, the majority of the funds are going to be going towards healthy buildings, covered buildings. So these are going to be projects in the form of building upgrades, anything that's going to make a building envelope more secure, doors, windows, insulation, roofing, things like that, as well as electrification measures. So these are going to be grants up to $25,000, specifically for commercial spaces. So a building owner that owns a commercial space covered by the HBO can apply, as well as a small business within a healthy buildings covered building. Additionally, this is unrelated, but I just because it's a public meeting, there's press here, this is recorded. There is a smaller budget for waste as well, and that is not constrained to healthy buildings. I think I got everything. I know it's different this year. It's a little bit confusing. We are pointing, any building projects need to have a free audit by ComEd before they apply. So they can attach that to the application, and an audit within the last 3 years is eligible. Or a comparable audit from a different organization we would accept as well, but we just need to be able to see that a building received that audit before the application goes live. Contact us, Sustain Evanston at cityofevanston.org, or go on the website. If you just Google Sustain Evanston, you should get there. That's my spiel.
Could you tell us what's the total dollar amount that has been allocated?
Sure. So it's $250,000, and then I think we are contributing a little bit more, so I believe it's around 300,000 this year. But if any press is recording that, please contact me later so that I can get you the total amount, not just off the top of my head amount.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. One other staff update. The city website is new.
Oh yes, we have a new website as well. The big change is that the place where our agenda is held is a little bit different. I will always have it in our calendar invite, and I have you all in a listserv, so you're going to get it in a few different ways. But if you're just looking on the website, if you go under the boards, committees, and commissions page and click on Healthy Buildings Accountability Board, it'll take you directly to the portal. So instead of hosting a PDF on the website, we have a direct link to the portal now. The Healthy Buildings Ordinance page is in. There are a few things that still need to be corrected, so more changes are happening. If you find a dead link anywhere under a sustainability page, please email me directly. If you find a dead link on a non-sustainability related page, contact 311. We're looking for them. We definitely don't want them to be there, but also recognizing that this is a huge process.
All right, so another quick update. You all had asked to have the housing folks give a presentation on the housing plan. So we got lots of questions from all of you, which was great. Sorted them and provided them to Uri over in community development. So they're working on those questions, but in terms of actually coming to present, it'll either be in April or May.
Great. Thank you, staff, for those updates. And now we're going to move into the healthy buildings, the equity priority buildings criteria discussion. And Bob and Jessica worked diligently on a pretty difficult task. So I'm going to pass it over to Bob.
Yeah, thanks. We based this on what we had talked about last time, but did a little more work to put all the different examples elsewhere in the country into matrix format, which was in the agenda link. I don't know if anyone will be able to see it if you pulled it up, but it's there if anyone wants to look on their laptop. So basically, we just made a list of all of the other jurisdictions with building performance standards or something like them, and then went through the different ways that they define affordability or give exemptions or alternative compliance pathways for different types of buildings. So I'll just give like some orientation and we can talk about this some. I think ultimately we do want to go through and talk about which of these do we like best, but I think we do need some more information discussion before we can do that. So I started with multifamily rental. There's a lot of them, a lot of different jurisdictions have thought about this. Each one has done it in a different way in terms of what exactly is the level at which you define affordability. But there are two different choices that you have in this, really. It's, are you defining affordability based on the cost of the unit, the rent or the price of the unit, or are you defining affordability based on the characteristics of the person who lives in that unit? So this is kind of a policy choice you have to make, and it's based on either, again, the rent, which is independent of somebody's income, or the actual income of the person who's living there. There's pros and cons to both of these. I think that in other housing work I've seen the city do, it's more based on the income of the people who live in the unit is the major determinant. So I think that may be what we think is most consistent with other city policy, but that is a choice we'll have to go through. Some pros and cons would be if you do it by rent or cost, you're not guaranteeing that the benefits or that the people who live there are actually low income. It could be a higher income person who's simply renting a lower cost unit. So it's not really capturing low-income people. On the other hand, to understand the income of the people in the units, you have to ask them all their incomes. So if it's already a kind of income-qualified building, you have that already, and that's easy. If it's not an income-qualified building, like a condo or like naturally occurring affordable housing, that's a whole lot of somewhat intrusive collection of data that you have to do before you can qualify the building. So in other words, there's pros and cons to both, and we should talk about the merits of both. So that's the first section here. We also, a couple places have specific rules for condos. Condos are particularly complicated, both in terms of how this could apply and then how condos make decisions in the first place. So I think that we'd want to have some special discussion of that. In terms of commercial, the only example we could find like the Denver one that we presented last time around based on a certain revenue level was Denver. There was nobody else who seemed to define small business by a revenue level. Others did it by category. A lot of places exempted or have alternative pathways for industrial or manufacturing properties because I think their use of energy isn't really related to the building. It's related to what they're doing in the building. So it's just, it doesn't apply the same way. Also warehousing and storage was exempted by a few. And Maryland, for whatever reason, had restaurants and food service businesses have their own alternative compliance pathways. I don't know what the logic for that was. And then for nonprofit, the final category, a lot of them have houses of worship are exempted. Others have direct service providers like Denver, which we looked at before, and also in Seattle calls that human services instead of direct services, but same general concept. As a community serving organization would have the ability to have an alternative compliance pathway. Two other things we saw in terms of exemptions or alternative pathways. One is buildings in financial distress. We have that in our ordinance already, that anybody in financial distress would not have to comply. However, how you define financial distress varies a little bit across the country, but that is defined in our ordinance already. So I'm just bringing that to everyone's attention. We already have that exemption in the ordinance, so we don't have to worry about that being discussed here, I don't think. And then some have special pathways for historic buildings, which might have particular challenges in complying. So we looked at all those. Again, I think it'd be useful at some point to go through kind of case by case and be like, which of these do we like the most? We also have some examples in here which Jessica put together. She can't be here today. That I will not walk through in a lot of detail because she really did the work on this. Looking at other programs related to energy and affordability in the region and see how they define affordability and how they exempt or qualify or whatever the appropriate thing would be, housing or small businesses for that. So those are examples from ComEd, from Evanston Zone CDBG, Illinois EPA, and other, Illinois Solar for All is a good example too. And programs like that. So that's just to give us more examples of how you can define affordability in a way that's already being used for public programs. So yeah, that's it. I just wanted to run through quick and would be happy to talk through in detail, or maybe, yeah, let's just do questions first and then we can get to what do we do with this information. Any clarifications or just questions anybody has?
A couple questions. I think and I don't know if this is what you're wanting us to bring up, but under existing definitions for multifamily rental, I was looking at the definition 2/3 of units, 2/3 of units, at least 40% of units. I think for me, understanding better the configuration of affordable housing units in Evanston, like is that even relevant for how we should define it? Or are they do they tend to be more scattered or more congregated? So that was one question I had. And then the programs that are here, or you said local programs, so I know, are we interested in looking outside of Illinois at what other types of programs? I know I came across a program, I think in Philadelphia, where building owners serving low-income communities can get basically a forgivable loan if they keep housing affordable for a certain percentage of time. So I thought that was really interesting.
Cool. Yeah, to those two things, I completely agree. We need some information on Evanston's building stock to understand, like, how does each of these apply to us? Because there's questions about how many units in the building we need to qualify. Also questions about income level. There's a lot of 80%, but Cambridge, Massachusetts, which might be the most comparable thing on here to Evanston, had 100% AMI because I think incomes are just higher than the metro area in that community. So I think we have to be pretty thoughtful about that. And I had a whole series of questions for the community development department about what they could tell us about housing affordability characteristics. So I completely agree. We kind of need that, in my opinion, before we decide anything. And in terms of case studies elsewhere, I mean, yeah, there's a ton of other examples. We did Illinois for other programs to just kind of like reduce the size of the universe a little bit, but certainly if there's good examples, other places we can learn from, always good to do. But there's a lot of them out there. So we drew the line someplace for first analysis, but happy to do more.
Should we consider mixed-use buildings? Or mixed use?
Mixed.
Or is that not? Mixed use.
That is an excellent question. I can't remember seeing how these different places categorize mixed use. Like there's the dominant use. Is that the one you go by? Right. So if it's first floor retail, mostly apartments, do you just go with the apartments? So I'm not sure, honestly. That's a good question that we can look into more and see how that's been addressed.
Yeah, I think, Bob, you're right. Like some of the places that I've seen, like Boston, for example, they do that. Like if more than 80% of your building is, say, residential, like which would be many of those just sort of the ground floor commercial, they either put them in, you know, sort of the multifamily residential category or something like that. And we could even, you know, there are some places that have sort of those different rules apply to the residential portion, and the commercial sort of set of rules apply to the commercial portion. So even like, you know, just looking at our own building stock, what would make most sense, we could consider things like that.
I was going to say not just the dominant use, but also the preponderance of revenue. It may be mostly used in terms of the space occupied by residential, but perhaps the revenue that's generated from the building comes from the retail component. Mm-hmm. I don't know if we should consider how much money is being generated by the retail or the residential components.
Yeah, that's a good idea too. I mean, I think we can look for some case studies and see what other people have tried with this. Does the city have anything anything comparable where you're defining a building as either residential or commercial based on some, if it's mixed use, based on some split of units or revenue or whatever? Do either of you know?
I would think that'd be solely by zoning. I mean, I know what you're getting at, but if it's zoned commercial, zoned residential, I think you would just do a weighted, you know, if it's 20%, or like what Shasti said, it's just, you treat the two differently, commercial versus residential.
Energy Star will collect the self-identified use type, and I think you can select up to 3, and you can also designate the square footage for each use type.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there could be some separate calculations. Ultimately, the building's either in or out. I don't think we'd have a situation where like you have to comply for the commercial, but the residential is exempted. That would just be way too complicated, I think. So we'd have to figure out a way for the building, like what is the answer for the building, I think, right? Okay.
I would also suggest, since I think a majority of the buildings that we will eventually designate as equity prioritized buildings will probably be, you know, 100% residential or at least classified as residential, but, you know, great preponderance residential. That and also the fact that we're probably going to have a list of equity prioritized buildings that is quite long already, and maybe longer than at least initially what we have funds to support with funding, that we focus on, you know, kind of the majority and not get too caught up in some of the exceptions or outliers, you know, and then kind of bring the outliers in as we see them. But I think we've got some big residential buildings that we really need to define. And I think one of the first tasks that we're going to have here is setting up the final criteria for equity prioritized buildings, and then kind of a prioritization within that group of equity prioritized buildings so that we can actually start doing some outreach and focusing on the most equity prioritized buildings to get some criteria back that we can actually put into the rulemaking, so we can, so we can actually make some decisions and get some things done, and then see how some of the outliers might fit into that. I think the same comment for what other cities may be doing in terms of programs. I think at least initially, the way we're going to be looking at this for the next year or two is what programs already exist for support. It would be great to look and see, are there other programs we should be advocating for? But if they don't exist now, I don't know that we're going to get them in place by the time the rulemaking needs to be done and accepted by City Council. So what support can we get from the programs that are already existing? How can we apply that to the equity prioritized buildings? And then, take a look at, are there other things that we should be suggesting to City Council or city staff to try and appropriate?
And the only other thing that I wanted to add is that the Healthy Buildings Technical Committee, has pretty much decided that they're going to develop their targets by Energy Star portfolio manager building type. So that's
Bob, what else can we do today to help make progress on this?
Honestly, I think we need some data about the building stock. I think it's going to be really hard to make those kind of decisions now. I think we could talk a little more conceptually around the non-housing pieces of this, the commercial and the nonprofit. Don't need quite as much data, I think, to have some discussion. So I'm not saying I'm saying making decisions, but we can talk about these different, because it's by type or classification. I think we just have a better intuitive understanding of how those might apply. But for housing, I think it's really important to know what our housing stock looks like and how these different standards would apply to that. But we could talk a bit about, for example, the nonprofit definitions and see what people think about that, and at least have some of the easy conversations first, or I think easier, and then come to the harder, more data-driven ones. So maybe I'll just open up for discussion. It seems like the common way to handle nonprofits is the Denver example is probably the most inclusive here, which is a nonprofit which provides direct services to the community and owns the building. So that would count a house of worship, it would count direct service providers, food pantry. It wouldn't count like a professional office, for example. But it would count anything where like people from the community would be served from that location. And there's a whole list in the Denver ordinance. I did not put that list here, but we had that in the materials last time, I think, just a list of use types. So I wanted to propose that seems like a reasonable way to go to me. I wanted to get thoughts from others about other ways of thinking about nonprofit alternative compliance pathways.
I was wondering if there's also like a revenue component that we should consider here. Like, I was wondering if there is a revenue component that we should consider here. Nonprofits that are maybe a certain size and might not need as much assistance. Maybe they have access to resources. But I was just thinking even smaller nonprofits that are operating even office spaces where clients might be coming in, or I don't know, it just feels like there are, along with direct services, perhaps revenue is like an important thing to think about too.
I have a question. When we talk about defining an equity prioritized building, and are we assuming that these buildings, piggybacking on what Swati just said, need an alternative compliance pathway or pathway assistance? Because I'm thinking, do we want buildings first to attempt to comply and then they would apply for an alternative compliance pathway decision? So do we get in the, because I don't think, because you would, in doing that, you would say, okay, with your application, you know, give me your last 2 years financial statement, and that would show, you know, revenue or, you know, that kind of thing. Versus just a blanket, you know, every equity prioritized building needs assistance and can't comply on its own with meeting the ordinance.
You know, that's a really good point, Stephanie, but I was thinking, could it also be just things like for some of the more obvious equity prioritized buildings that, you know, those are smaller nonprofits or whatever, could assistance, initial assistance look like maybe a very small thing, but like helping them evaluate where they're at, their current energy usage and what it would take for them to reach compliance, just sort of like a plan before they even start doing any work. And that is the work maybe they need to do first to even understand if they can comply easily or if they would need alternative compliance pathways. So it's almost kind of like the pre-work, whether they can do it themselves or with a consultant. So I feel like sort of going back to what Paula was saying, we have our list, and then within that, there is more of a classification of who needs what and help first. So that's sort of what I am thinking. Not a lot of money, maybe not a lot of assistance, but just sort of that initial pre-design type of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's another conversation about what do you get when you're an equity prioritized building, which I think is an equally important conversation, which maybe we just want to get into here because this keeps coming up as we are trying to define equity prioritized buildings, like what does it mean to be one? But it's kind of two separate conversations. One is like, what criteria do we use to judge if you're in or not, and then what happens when you're in? So they relate to each other, but perhaps we should turn a bit to like what happens when you're in, so we get a better understanding of that as we're making these calls about what buildings are prioritized. We did not do research on that yet. We are researching on the determination of what is equity prioritized building, not like what assistance do you get from the city if you are one. So, but that could be good to spend some time brainstorming it here, because that seems like that comes up.
And I think we should do more research on that too. Like we could, like just like Bob and Jessica, you've done the work for what qualifies as equity. Like I think we can, so we should certainly have the discussion, but also maybe do a slightly similar exercise to what types of, because there are tiers of assistance that different cities are offering. Some of it, you know, is financial. Some of it is something else. We could do that work too, and I'm happy to help with that. I think that does help, like decide, okay, we can consider them equity prioritized because this sort of help is, you know, appropriate for them.
Yeah, I just, I agree that, or in sort of in response to your question, I think we define what it is, and if a building owner meets that eligibility criteria, then they get to choose, do they need the array of supports, and if so, which supports, and there's processes they go through to request those, and then there's standards the city uses to determine if in fact it's a priority to provide whatever level of service that the applicant is requesting.
I was not under the impression that being designated an EPB would make you automatically eligible for direct subsidy assistance. I didn't assume that was the case. Also wanted to say that, you know, we can, you know, not-for-profits revenue is public data. 990 forms are available online, and you can see how much money, you know, they make. And I think we should probably look into that. I guess the elephant in the room is perhaps a special conversation about Northwestern should happen at some point. A separate and special conversation.
Right, I agree, and I don't know to what extent the income level, I mean, a small nonprofit that's, you know, existing on $500,000 budget probably does not own their building. And larger nonprofits, often are not able to invest in upgrades in their building. They're barely like kind of keeping above. So in the nonprofit world, the size of your revenue doesn't always equate to the capacity to do that. So just want to put that out there. But I agree with Baxter. I don't know do we want to exempt Northwestern to give them an alternative pathway, or is there some like in between?
Well, there's already a measure in the ordinance, I believe, that would, I mean, anybody can apply for an alternative compliance pathway, not just an equity prioritized building. And, you know, to take a step back, I think the assumption when the ordinance was created was, first of all, you know, you'd hope that every building can eventually meet the goals. But then you establish a list of equity prioritized buildings that can be used in a number of different ways. And you also establish alternative compliance pathway forms and criteria so that whether you're an equity prioritized building or not, if there's a good reason for not complying, like let's say I just replaced my boiler last year, I need an alternative compliance pathway to give me an extra 5 years, you know, to replace it again or something. You know, you don't have to be equity prioritized to submit an alternative compliance pathway plan. I think the intent of equity prioritized buildings was to establish some sort of list so that whatever hurdles or challenges come along to meeting, whether it's the every 5 year or the final goals, what special considerations might those buildings get, whether it's funding from any other grants that we might get or city funding that's established in the future, or whether it's, you know, extra special consideration on their alternative compliance pathway plan as that comes along. I think in the final rulemaking, City Council is going to be looking for some language in the rule book about how, you know, what does it mean to be an equity prioritized building and how will that help certain buildings? You know, they're going to want to know before they pass the final rules, you know, how certain buildings will, I would think, I can't speak for City Council, but I believe so. I had another point, I forgot what it was. I'll bring it up when I think of it. You know, so it's kind of like, oh, I know. And then also eventually, whether fines are collected for not complying with benchmarking or whether fines are eventually collected because people just don't submit their plans or whatever, that pot of money would then first be prioritized to help equity prioritized buildings. As far as Northwestern, if we define this, and I guess I would throw the two hospitals in the same group, if we define it as providing direct services to the community and maybe even further define that, you know, I think that's an automatic definition. Northwestern does have some special consideration because I believe somewhere in the ordinance we do call out district energy, you know, district thermal energy is already being recognized, not as equity prioritized, but as having the right to submit an alternative compliance pathway plan. Actually, anybody can submit an alternative compliance pathway plan, but, you know, in order to sort of recognize the special nature of a district thermal energy system, which Northwestern has, and probably hospitals as well, that was specifically called out. So they've already kind of got their special consideration.
Yeah. So in terms of what kinds of nonprofits are likely to have this apply to them, I mean, houses of worship for sure. There's going to be a bunch of them. That's probably the most common. Hospitals or other healthcare is very likely. Just looking at like the initial list of covered buildings, hospitals and medical offices may or may not, depending on ownership, qualify there. There's a handful of private schools that are sometimes actually nonprofits, or other education like daycares can be nonprofits. There's a handful of them, handful of museums. But really, there's not a huge list of buildings that I think are going to be nonprofit owned in the first place, because as people have said, most small nonprofits do not own their building. And that's really one of the criteria that it seems like other places use is, are you the building owner? And if you're just a tenant, then the building owner is the one who's going to have to comply.
But do we want to consider commercial or office buildings that have a lot of nonprofit tenants? The smaller nonprofit tenants. I mean, I think that's important too. I just, sort of the same idea behind residential. Like, your property owner is one entity, but the folks who are renting so I do think that we need to consider that. There are I don't know off the top of my head, but there are certain buildings that just have a lot of nonprofit offices in them, and they are tenants.
I haven't found other examples of other places that have tried to do that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't, but I think we would have to figure it out. And that may be one of these, my thought is there's certain types of criteria that make you an equity prioritized building. And then you can also apply to B1 to say, okay, your circumstances of mine are different and distinct, but I'm serving all these nonprofits. And so we could have a pathway as well for people to individually say this should apply to me because I am particularly community serving, even though a private landlord. So I think we might need that instead of rules around it. It might just be you can make a case, and then it's considered case by case.
Maybe. And I also feel just exploring sort of our buildings that are qualifying for all of this a little bit, just as you were saying, but some others were saying to just us understand. So maybe we're going down a rabbit hole that we don't have to. Maybe there are just 2 buildings like that or something, and. But yeah.
Another complexity of this is going to be how well the Energy Star use types line up with these nonprofit definitions. So something to keep in mind, but just being aware of the time. Some really good discussion going on. There's so many different decision points. Even when we say, let's focus on the easy one first, it's there's a lot. So just thinking ahead to future meetings and how do we come to decision points, taking notes, I'm hearing a couple different decision points. We have ownership kind of piece, whether you own or lease, and the importance of the majority use type, as well as, something we brought up very early on in our EPB discussion was application versus city designation and the burden of putting more work on these covered buildings. So that's another decision point. And then part of that is the criteria. So the availability of the public information and the housing type, right? There was these are individual tenants and that's not public information for the city. So there could be differences in these categories of EPBs, and by categories I mean commercial versus multifamily versus condo versus nonprofit. So there could be some differences in how you get designated and whether it's an application or the city already has the information. We also know that there are nonprofits that kind of at a surface level we wouldn't be concerned about. While alternative compliance is probably relevant for Northwestern, their endowment is large enough that I personally am not thinking of them as an equity priority building. So those are some of the key decision points. And I'm trying to think about what's the best way to get this in front of you guys so that you're able to start making decisions. And so that'll kind of flow nicely into what Paul is going to lead us on. But is there any other key decision points related to nonprofits that people are thinking of so that in a meeting or two, we can have something a little bit more tangible? It's not just verbal. We can point to things and say, I proved this part.
I think just more broadly, if we had a document that was the sequence of big questions we need to answer. So, because I feel, for me, I need a visual. So first question we want to answer is this, and then the second question is this. And, and sometimes they might overlap a little or they sort of depend on each other. But if we can organize the flow of the universe and, because it seems like we hop along to different of the big questions, but I'm not even sure if we all agree what all the big questions are.
Okay, so not assigning this right now, but I think that'll be homework, and we'll have to, what we're doing next month is a whole separate discussion, but so I like this idea of getting something a little bit more tangible so that we're a little bit more focused, but trying to keep things moving forward. I just lost my train of thought. Other things that we need to do. People were kind of confused like, what is the point of being an EPB? We came up with that goal, but it's really high level. And it used to be defined through the grant funds, and that doesn't exist anymore, right? So at a high level, the point is financial and technical assistance. It's reducing, those are like, if you like summed up all the barriers to this ordinance, it's either I don't have enough money, or I don't know what to do, or I don't know how to do it, basically. That's going to vary every single year based on the city budget. So there's kind of like the influence in terms of like what we could define a bunch of equity priority buildings. Maybe that helps empower staff to say, we need this much budget, or we can go for this grant. But it's a little bit cyclical in terms of, does that make sense? And like, there needs to be a need, which we're defining the need, but we don't want to define the need without knowing like, what can we even provide? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like also in other places, alternative compliance pathways aren't just the financial piece. It's you might have more time, like an extended timeline to comply. You might not have to hit the same standard as other buildings, or just it's some like longer point in the future. So I think there are things, even with the uncertainty of funding, there are things you can do to make it easier for building owners to comply. So I think that's probably part of the conversation too. It's not just the financial stuff.
And I also like the idea of, even if we don't have the funds now, but like knowing what the need is might be easier than to look for those types of funding sources perhaps, or make a case if there was a grant opportunity, or, you know, we would be more ready to try to do stuff like that. And I don't know. I think it's always good to identify the need too.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of how I forgot that I felt this way. That we should just define every single building that's an equity priority building. That it doesn't matter what resources are available to help them. They're an equity priority building. If it turns out that we don't have the resources, then that's when we expedite the alternative compliance.
Yeah.
Or in the worst case scenario, they're exempt.
Yeah, I think so. And then, you know, just some benefits like alternative compliance pathways, like, you know, maybe you are more willing to offer that to an equity prioritized building versus somebody who's not in that category, unless they can really make a good case. You know, I think just, you know, there could even be things like that, I feel, which is more helpful.
Okay, I'm going to make a flow diagram so that we can have something that kind of explains the process a little bit in terms of like, you meet the criteria, you're an equity priority building, are funds available, what are the different supports? If you got none of the supports, then what's your next option? It's expedited alternative compliance, something along those lines. Whether it's helpful for this group, I think it'll probably be a nice end deliverable for city council, because I'm a visual person, so.
Can you talk a little bit more about, I think you said, what if we just act like every building is an equity prioritized building?
Not every building, but that the availability of support doesn't dictate whether you're an equity priority building.
Correct, right, okay.
That's what I mean. So
you can be that without getting any support.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that allows us to look at other levers, which is the alternative compliance or all the way to exemption. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Okay.
total sense.
Well, and likewise, you can apply for alternative compliance without being an equity prioritized building for other technical reasons or whatever. So I would also suggest that because, again, the majority of the equity prioritized buildings, I think, are going to end up being residential buildings, you know, and the big concern here in Evanston is not displacing people because of rising rents. One of one category of important information that we're going to need to be able to make these final definitions is more information on the residential buildings that are on the covered buildings list. And so, you know, I think that would, the sooner we can have that discussion with community development, and I actually like Kristen's recommendation from last month that we maybe devote a whole meeting to affordability, and I would even further define that to affordability of residential rents. Do we need to bring in anybody else to talk about rent affordability so that we can better understand the housing rental affordability market here and how that applies to our covered buildings? Because I have a feeling that whatever final list we come up with, equity prioritized buildings, let's say it's 180 buildings, I bet 150 of those buildings are going to be minimum residential, with affordable or less than less than certain percent AMI or however we define residential. So I guess that would be a vote for if we can have that discussion with community development and whatever else goes into that definition next month. It might move us along a little bit faster. And I was making those numbers up. I have no knowledge of what the numbers are. That was just like made up.
Wanting to wrap up this portion, how do we move forward? And also, before we start talking about maybe like homework, next month, the technical committee's chair, Joel, did suggest that our two groups have a joint meeting. I'm not sure about the best way to schedule that. I know a few folks have brought up that they will be out of town next month. It's spring break. We certainly want to keep everyone on the same page, and especially if it's going to be our special joint meeting, don't want folks to miss that opportunity, which potentially kicks this discussion and the community development presentation to May. I don't think the community development needs to hear I don't think the technical committee needs to hear the community development presentation. So go ahead.
I know Joel's our chairman, but he'll tell you I'm the most chatty during. So speaking for the technical committee, I don't know if we need to have a joint meeting just yet. What I think would benefit us both is getting our definitions worked out. Like, for instance, we're still working on energy use targets, and what those targets are for until we reach 2050. We're still working on renewable energy and where someone could purchase that and everything that goes with that. So I think if we get some definitions in place and like have that community development meeting, because we're also having the same conversations too about buildings and building types and what they can and cannot do. So I think if we first have a discussion with community development about what the lay of the land looks like, that map is helpful, we should push that meeting out. It would be my recommendation, the joint meeting.
Great. Yeah. Well, that keeps things a little bit easier for us. Hopefully we can get community development in April. But we should still reschedule based on the members who I've heard request that they won't be able to make the meeting. So does anyone have a recommendation for the best way to schedule that? Okay. I don't think everyone pulling up their calendars in the meeting is going to be the best. So we'll do that asynchronously. Look for an email from me or staff.
Okay. So you definitely want to try to reschedule the April meeting and have the housing folks there, community development. Okay.
I think you asked for suggestions on moving forward or just ideas. I think I find reacting to something can smooth or speed the process versus creating from nothing. So if we have an idea of the big questions we want to answer, like perhaps having smaller groups working to just bring examples or like, here's what we recommend, and we can workshop that in session, then move on to the next thing. So, defining what is an equity prioritized building and having a couple of people make recommendations, some things to yet to be determined based on future discussions, but kind of start to bring some structure to keep us focused. And then I know I work better with something to react to.
And going off what Paula said is the majority of EPBs would probably be residential. I would suggest that because you can't go into each multifamily building and say, oh, is that one? You know, what's the AMI there? So I would go first by a list of what is listed as an affordable housing building. You know, they're getting LIHTC dollars and so forth. And then second, I have seen a lot of conversation around City of Evanston's map and what is known to be areas of the city that where housing that is, I don't know what you want to call it, but those areas of the city that are of concern of, what's the word I'm looking for? The areas, you know, that we are sensitive to in this effort, we look at those multifamily buildings there, because you can't go on a, you know, there's 180 list of multifamilies that are on the covered buildings list. We're not going to be able to go to all of them and say, you know, what do your tenants look like? You know, because I have a building that's market rate, but I'm hosting tenants that receive vouchers and other kinds of assistance. So we're never going to be able to pull that. So I'm suggesting that you first look at those two criteria and see what multifamilies fit in there.
Yeah, and we're also still working on the map that we have one person in the IT department who does the GIS work. So it's coming, and I'm very much hoping that by April we will have a map with all the different layers. So you'll have the covered buildings, you'll have the different wards, you'll have the TIFs, the SSAs, you'll have the census tracts, so that you'll be able to kind of narrow this down. So hopefully the tool will come to help you soon.
Well, I think that would be a consideration besides just when is community development available to meet with us. Also, when in April, do we think that map would be available? You know, and then maybe you could send out a doodle poll or something with the confluence of those two things. Give us some options for voting on are we available or not. I think that would be a much more productive meeting, even if it's a little bit later in the month than the first week of the month, which I think is spring break anyway.
Okay, all right.
Do we want to kind of assign some work for things to do between now and that meeting? It sounds, am I understanding like you're thinking maybe like we separate into like these two people focus on multifamily and these two people are nonprofit, or what did?
My recommendation would be that a couple people come together and basically build out, and this sounds very basic, but I think the work is not that, it doesn't have to be that complicated in how we organize it. Like sort of the flow, like a worksheet, like first we're answering this question, or how do we define this with some suggestions and things to be determined. So we start to outline the parameters of the questions we need to answer in a visual way, and the categories that we need to dig into. Like just get that written down, because it's what is equity prioritized buildings, and then what is available to those that qualify, and then how do they do, like there's a sort of sequence to kind of go through, and identifying what are the questions in each of those sort of buckets, so that we can kind of be disciplined and go through that in a more methodical way. Just a suggestion. So I know everyone's brains work differently, but my brain is unfortunately very linear.
Well, it sounds like you have a vision. So do you want to help us take that on?
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to help bring structure if there's other people to help build out the content of that. So
I think unfortunately you're only allowed to work with one other person until it becomes a meeting.
Yeah. Anyone?
I'm happy to help Kristen if you want.
Okay, great.
That sounds great. Thank both of you. Try and keep you posted on how the agenda is looking for next month, because maybe community development says they're not ready. That means we'll hopefully have a lot of time for the work that you're volunteering to do. Or maybe they'll say we need like the whole meeting. You guys asked so many questions. So just kind of keep you posted.
I was thinking we could even if we do not get community development, we could lay out the steps, like, these are the things that we need answers to, and if we get them quickly, great. Otherwise, even at the next meeting. So from what I can, and it's sort of kind of very similar to how you were summarizing our nonprofit discussion, like, these are key decision points? And I expect, like, Kristen, perhaps that's sort of what you are saying as well. What are the key questions when we are talking about multifamily or nonprofit? Sort of putting those together. What are our, so I think we can do that even if we don't know the answers to them quite yet, right? So, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I don't have the agenda in front of me. I think we're good on equity priority buildings.
We do have 2 maps that Baxter had asked to present last meeting that I want to make sure that we look at really quickly,
Yes.
just so we don't bump them again.
You guys have these maps in your packet, and Gabriella mentioned it just briefly here, that part of what we should be considering is geography. When we talk about the equity priority buildings, it's nothing complicated. There are 2 census tracts that have traditionally been Evanston's low-income, red line, discriminated against communities. And so we need to ensure that when we begin to make definitions and rules, we consider these components. I don't know that today is the day to sort of go through that. But the second part is geography also generates potential subsidies, right? Because SSAs are tax levying bodies that have their own publicly generated revenue that could be used to, it's already used to improve facilities inside those SSA areas, those special service areas. And obviously, renovations, rehabilitation of residential buildings is an eligible cost for tax incremental financing. And so I don't know that we can convince the joint body, the joint review board, to consider these improvements as eligible for tax incremental financing, but we should certainly ask. And I think that that's probably a big ask for the Department of Community Development when they come. But we also need to consider, if they're going to help us think through affordability and some of these other issues, perhaps there are other departments, boards, committees, councils within the city of Evanston that can help us determine some of these other questions about EPB as well. I don't think that we need to be experts on everything. It's really time for us to start drawing down the expertise from everyone, community-wide, not just the city, but Evanston has a lot of smart people who live here and who can help us think through these things.
Can I ask a question? This is my first time sitting on a committee like this, and so I'm wondering, what is the role of staff in bringing stuff forward or recommending things versus what is it completely driven by us, or is staff just supporting us, or is staff also saying, here are the things we want you to answer and figure out, and here's some, like, what's that balance look like?
As far as I understand the role of staff, it's really a facilitating role to help you guys do your work.
It's something that we are figuring out as we go too. I mean, we want to support you in any way possible. If there's, things that we can do as full-time staff that, you are obviously a volunteer board, we'll do everything that we can, but really the direction is driven by you all. But I would say as relevant things come up and, if we wanted to put something on the agenda, it would be something that we would talk to Ben and Baxter about. It's not just something that we would unilaterally throw it and say, you guys need to work on this. So it's really collaborative. We're a resource. we can't always accommodate asks, but I would say ask us for whatever comes up and you need, and we'll try and help out with that.
The ordinance language is also helpful for that. But I think this leads nicely into what Paula put together for us, which is like a RACEEE exercise. So helping to define who's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, and defining a little bit better what pieces of this work are staff doing, or is the technical committee doing, is this board doing. So go ahead and move over to that.
Sure, yeah, and realizing that we only have, 13 minutes left, or 15, whatever the clock, whichever clock is correct. So this table that was attached to the agenda was put together in order to help facilitate sort of future project management planning, and to take all of the tasks in the original ordinance, as well as updates based on discussions that we've had here, discussions that the technical committee has had about some of the additional tasks that maybe weren't so well fleshed out in the ordinance, in order to get us to the point of implementation. I took my first crack at who's responsible versus who's accountable versus who's just to be consulted, to have input versus who gets informed, and then divided those up by our group, the HBAB, the technical committee, city staff, and then ultimately city council. I put a column in here for building owners that we could fill in later, but the building owners aren't really directly doing the rulemaking, but are certainly going to be impacted by all the rulemaking. And I tried to organize it according to the different phases of our work. The first phase is initial research, which is what we're doing now, which is what Bob and Jessica did, which is what the technical committee has been doing. The one area that really stands out there is getting this additional input on equity prioritized buildings that we need to make our decisions. The next major category would be analyzing the data, setting criteria, and engaging with stakeholders. And in that case, I'm open to any comments that you all have, especially about, for instance, like reviewing the existing benchmarking and beam data. I put the technical committee as being responsible for that, us being consulted, and staff being ultimately be accountable, but maybe that's not correct, so there are some certain areas where I would really welcome some comments on whether I got it right. Creating a benchmarking, compliance, and follow-up plan. Again, I put the technical committee as being responsible for that, but maybe that's staff, maybe that's us if we, identify equity prioritized buildings that need some outreach and follow-up. So, some of those things I wasn't totally sure. So I'm absolutely open to any comments here. But the idea was to put together a list of all the tasks that anybody involved in the rulemaking has to do, who's responsible, and then, if we as the HBAB can focus on the things where we're responsible, that will help us define what do we do at each meeting. It'll help us define the agendas for each meeting and kind of a timeline. The one basic category that I realized is a completely glaring omission here is before we get to the implementation phase, the whole rule-making, the rule book, or whatever we want to call it, needs to be approved by City Council. So I will be adding that, and that has a couple of precursors. It's probably education of City Council. It might be meeting one-on-one with City Council members. It might be creating a presentation for City Council. That work would be done in conjunction, very close between us and the very, very close collaboration with the technical committee. So I do need to add some tasks there before the actual implementation, because the rules have to be approved before we can implement. So I will be adding that. But just in going through this, I think for our agenda setting for the future and for our timeline setting for the future, it would be good to focus on the things that we're responsible for so that we could start to check off, okay, we're responsible for this. Okay, what do we need to do it? And hopefully eventually, okay, we did it. Move on to the next thing. So I don't know if there are questions, comments, but that was the purpose of this document.
You made this?
Yeah.
It's awesome.
It was basically.
Thank you.
But please send comments. I mean, basically what I drew from, since our electrification working group was responsible for working with city staff originally on getting the initial ordinance passed, what was on our minds then, and how did we see the steps playing out, to get this thing to actual implementation. So it was informed by that. But anything you all, we know more now about how things have been going. Anything you all want to submit as comments, I guess we can't talk amongst ourselves, but one-on-one we can talk. So you can submit comments to me, or if it's more like you think staff should be doing something different, if you want to submit it to Gabriella as well, either way would be fine. And then I don't know, I could volunteer to work with Ben on how to translate this into a timeline for future agenda. I mean, if you're looking for volunteers for homework, or Ben, what would be helpful to you?
I'm happy to keep working on it with you.
Okay.
From the version of this that we saw last month to now, it's a difficult task to plan. Last meeting we came up with the great idea that we want to invite community development, and then I was like, oh, maybe they can be here in 3 months. So the planning is just hard. So figuring out what's that middle ground of like, all right, we're not going to be able to say what we're going to do in July, but defining better our end goals, our products, our deliverables, and who is responsible and accountable and informed. I think that's like the next, how we continue to iterate. So.
Yeah, it's really more of kind of like an order of things rather than we have to do this by March, we have to do this by April. It's what comes first, what comes next, what comes after that, and then kind of adjusting it depending on, what input's available, what outreach we need to do. Gabriella, to update this thing, I might have some questions for you specifically on what staff expects to do in terms of outreach to the building owners versus what you want the committees to do. So I'll follow up with you directly on that so I can update this and add some comments.
Do folks need some more clarity on some end deliverables? So we have an ordinance. We have right now, I think we have, it's dated because the ordinance passed, but we have basically like a benchmarking. I'll call it a rule book. It tells you like, here's how to log into Energy Star. It takes the ordinance and puts it into lay terms. It makes it all feel more tangible. And so I'm imagining something similar for HBO, which would mean we kind of have two guiding documents. We have one that is, I'll call the rule book. It's more living. It's in lay terms. You don't have to be a lawyer. And then we also have the ordinance. And do folks need more clarity on like what the difference is between those? Or maybe there's a different solution. Maybe so.
I mean, I like the idea of like using the rule book for now as like sort of a guiding framework of that's where we are trying to get or trying to go. And if we decide to change things a little bit along the way, maybe that would be fine. But it did sound like a good approach to work towards, at least.
Okay. Last comment on this is one of the challenges between having those two documents is going to be like, does city council empower us and staff? Or like, how do you make updates to that more layperson's version without it becoming like a bureaucratic mess? So a future issue, but something that we'll work towards defining. I know we did have a technical committee update on the agenda, but we did hear a little bit from you already on that. Was there any other key information that anyone wanted to share on that topic during this meeting?
No, we also are in a point where we need to identify putting things down now. I'll call it in writing. So that's kind of where we're at. We've been gathering a lot of information, I would say, these past 6 months. And now we've got the information, we can start making some definitions. So.
Okay. I think there's no other pieces of our agenda that we haven't covered, so I think I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion to adjourn our meeting.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, this meeting is adjourned at 11:26.